Delighted to meet you, Maurizio. Welcome to the Leaders Who Care series.
Thank you, Mark. It's really great to be here and sort of share a lot of shared vision.
Absolutely. I'm going to have a lot of fun with this conversation for sure. And, first of all, thanks to LWC at Knowledge Pledge for introducing us to you and all the great work that you're doing. Let's start, though, with if you could just, if you will, formally introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about you. Not everything. We want to do the whole interview in 2 minutes, but a little bit about you personally. Maybe there's something no one in the world knows about you that you want to share now. Who knows? But share.
Well, I don't know if I can quite rise to that claim, but quick history. I'm trained as a scientist. I did the first sort of third of my life in scientific research. And then discovered that I am a better entrepreneur than I am perhaps a scientist. And so made that transition to the dark side of taking some of my technology and inventions and starting to build companies with it. This goes back a long time. First third of my life as a scientist, second third as a entrepreneur. And then toward the middle of that entrepreneurship history, I made a transition into medicine and technology applied to medical practice. And so I work both in the biotech field and in the biotherapeutics as well as the diagnostic field. And it was toward the end of that phase, about 10 years ago, that I was recruited by Bill Gates to begin the last chapter of my life, which I would describe as the impact chapter, where suddenly building companies and making money didn't seem nearly as important and as interesting as doing that by marshaling the resources of the private sector of our companies to really drive a model to drive solutions to the world's most daunting problems, and in a way that you would measure their performance on impact as opposed to normal financial measures. And so for the last almost 10 years, I built and then led an effort called Global Good, which ended up being one of the largest translational programs in the world. It used, of course, capital from the Gates Foundation Charitable Trust to essentially partner with researchers and developers of technologies to solve some of humanity's most daunting problems, and to do that on a sort of industrial scale. So we ended up operating in 130 countries, deployed hundreds of millions of dollars worth of capital that ended up becoming a moonshot factory, if you want to think of it that way. Nowadays, I should say a Mars shot factory that was really tackling problems that no one was bothering to tackle because they were viewed very hard, but often had solutions in the ecosystem of research and academic research, but requires some substantial effort to translate into practical inventions that would actually affect people and could be brought to life. And so that's what we did, and we learned a lot of things. We were very successful on most metrics, but that success also included many learned lessons that today sort of put me at the center of this idea of impact investing and impact development, and that sort of brings us current to the initiatives that I'm launching in collaboration with the Knowledge Pledge and a few others to sort of step up on what we've even did under the Gates ecosystem.
So always a new chapter, never a retire, right? Always a new chapter.
That is what my wife has been telling me that she's really afraid of. But to some extent, I think I've been handed some opportunities, both as an entrepreneur, sort of learning the private sector, as a scientist, learning the academic and research sector, And then with this sort of irrational exuberance around optimism that science can solve some of these problems. We just haven't used it effectively to learn this whole subject of how do you translate scientific research into innovation that makes a difference. And now the opportunity to bring it all together and do it perhaps on an even grander scale than what I got to do for Bill. Bill is an incredibly Bill and the foundation are incredible institutions that are really making a difference in many parts of the world, but they're also focused, and that's part of their success, is they're very focused on certain problem sets. And I think humanity is suffering by so many problems that I think to sort of repeat that experience with those learned lessons, but do it in sectors that are not necessarily the staple of the Gates Foundation or some of the other great charities that are around is part of the sort of unique sauce that I'm bringing to my next chapter.
No, I love it. And as we've talked, I mean, that's why Fifth Element was formed, to be able to work with clients to allocate their marketing investment dollars along with their philanthropic dollars to impact for good ROIs and good ability to attract the best talent who wants to be in organizations like that. So I so relate. Did you ever see this coming as a kid?
Well, it's funny. I used to have the cliche that I used to tell my mom, I want to do something important and I want to do something, I want to leave the world as a better place. But of course, that's a kid's talking, right? And so as I went through a journey that is very similar to what I think a lot of CEOs or entrepreneurs do. That first you measure the importance of what you're doing, and the value of what you're doing by the stakeholders that you are affecting. So obviously the employees, the communities you're working with, the shareholders that you're supporting. And then you realize that, and this is clearly my biggest learned lessons from the experience with Global Good and Bill Gates, is that when you have the courage to tackle some of the most difficult problems on the planet that also affect a lot of us as a society. And if you are fortunate enough to find solutions to those problems, then what you have are the ingredients of making the great unicorns of tomorrow. So the great companies of tomorrow are actually, in my opinion, those that are actually solving some of the great problems of tomorrow. And so my translation through the Gates years for me has been to realize that doing impact is not just a charitable, honorable, noble thing to do, but doing impact is actually a great business strategy to build great companies. And so this is where the sort of grand convergence came to me, that ultimately, if you are building a strategic plan for the creation of great new companies, you better be chasing companies that have a list of potential and that are striving to move the needle on some of these big problems, because by almost definition, you're going to be building the next unicorns. And frankly, it turns out that it's just as hard to solve small problems as it is to solve big problems. And so if you're going to spend shareholders' money solving something, you might as well solve the big problems and deliver the shareholder return. So I am one of those impact investors that is not apologetic for the impact in terms of delivering shareholder return. I honestly believe that we will have better shareholder value, better shareholder return, better financial execution if we tackle some of the hardest problems. Now, hard problems are risky. And so you have to adopt the right methodologies to manage the risk. Mm-hmm. Okay. And that's the other part of my 10 years with Gates learn lessons, but assuming you know how to do that, then the world is, every single big problem that is out there is actually a fantastic opportunity to create private sector involvement that both solves the problem and chases after new markets and emerging markets. And I think that's the credo, the fundamental thesis that moves everything that I'm doing nowadays.
No, it's brilliant. And it segues into a question I want to ask you. We talked about big problems, and if you but you have to have collaboration, alliances, innovation together to tackle big problems, and that does impact what we call the human element. Alongside that, bring an Ad Astral into it, you're looking at companies all the time. You're looking at companies that you would want to invest in, and some of them are well-meaning. They want to make an impact. Some more than others. Different variability there. How is your experiences that you're talking about? No cuteness intended here, but impacted how you evaluate. You find, you evaluate, you secure, you decide, you help grow the companies you're investing in, and everybody gets an economic and social impact.
Yeah, so there are multiple elements to that answer, or to the answer to that question. So the first one is, we've been talking about impact, and I am willing to bet that every member of the audience has a different definition of what impact means.
Right.
Okay. And by the way, there is no right answer or wrong answer. A small business person who is building a small business and is essentially feeding and giving opportunities to employees has an impact, and it's a great impact. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm not one to want to judge what's a good impact or what's not a good impact. But I do think that we need to set an objective in terms of how do we define impact, and then use that as a sort of rubric for the decisions that we make. And in that sense, that becomes a strategy. So Ad Astral is probably one of the first examples of an impact venture capital fund. The idea is to put risk capital that knows how to manage risk at the service of providing the solutions to the biggest problems on the planet. And with those solutions, build great companies. Okay. The second key issue, once you define impact, is that most people start businesses and even drive scientific and technological evolution and discovery. They do it by first inventing something and then asking the question, what can you do with that? Okay. And I call that the accidental pipeline.
Right.
Okay. It's not in the old days, they used to say, if you put enough monkeys in front of a typewriter and you let them type letters at random, eventually, if you give it enough time, they'll write you the great novel of tomorrow. Okay. Well, that's sort of an almost random process. That's why I called it an accidental pipeline. Okay. What I think we need to do is flip that model around and be problem first. So we should ask the question, what problem do we choose to solve? Based on that problem, then you have to canvas the world for the technology, the discoveries, the science, the business people that have the know-how to solve that problem. And then you build the companies with those ingredients. Okay. And so bringing together this notion of impact, for us, we think of the world as having a set of problems, and we score the problems based on quantitative metrics of impact. So, for example, we do a lot in healthcare. And in healthcare, if you asked, there are entities like in the UN system that had to think about how to spend their dollars, which inevitably is not enough dollars, to move the needle on some of the biggest human health conditions on the planet. And those could be sicknesses and diseases. It could be wellness. It could be prevention. It could be interventions that relate to that. So they developed this concept of a DALY. The DALY stands for Disability Adjusted Life Years. And if you think about the DALY as a measure, it would be easy to say, look, we're going to worry about the most deadly diseases, and we'll focus on the most deadly diseases based on mortality. And that's the problem we're going after. But that doesn't really capture the impact. Think about somebody who's sick and is significantly disabled, but it's not dead. That person has a quality of life issue, impacts their community, their family, impacts their ability to be economically viable and be productive in society. And I would venture to say the impact of somebody who's sick a good portion of their life, but doesn't die, or doesn't die out of the sickness, might be just as high as the impact of somebody who catches a deadly disease and dies. Okay. So while this is a little morbid to be talking in terms of people's lives, but the DALI concept really filters for all of the impacts out of healthcare or lack of healthcare. And you could ask the question, if you score things by DALI, what are the biggest human health conditions that we should be addressing that are going to reduce that disability? And as an investor, I'm also introducing an economic term. If I could lower the cost of delivering reduction in those DALIs, so if I could essentially establish a metric of cost per DALI averted, then you have a formula that is likely to scale, because if something is very efficient in how it can eliminate sources of sickness and disability in human condition, well, then you really are scoring it high in terms of importance and ability to scale up. And so we think about these type of quantitative metrics and then created a framework to sort of create a P&L, if you want to think of it that way, that is based on this notion of lowering the cost per unit of impact in the healthcare side per DALI, as the way we think about what solutions, what ideas, what projects, we bring forward. And so if I had to give you a very simplistic headline, our healthcare practice is looking to invest in the companies that will deliver the highest possible DALI reduction at the lowest possible cost. And that is the business strategy of the companies that we impose. And if you think about that business strategy, and if you think about things that could really drive that metric, you almost by definition have some great companies in the making, because that same metric, in addition to being a high impact metric, becomes a high return metric. And it becomes a scalable metric, because these are companies that have global needs and for which they are going to be accessing global markets.
It almost makes you think of the movie Field of Dreams, where they say, build it and they will come. You're building something to solve a big problem. The money will come.
Well, that certainly has been the hope, and that has been the experience. The other thing that comes is people that want to help you solve the problem. Mm-hmm. And so, at the time when it's incredibly competitive to retain great talent, and frankly, in order to be cost effective, we're never going to be able to pay what some of the existing big tech companies and other companies are paying. We have an uncanny opportunity to draw global talent in ways, and also drive global collaboration. I can't begin to tell you how many scientists are hearing about our grand challenges, and these are Nobel Prize winning type of scientists, and they come and talk to us about an idea they had, that really didn't materialize until they heard about the problem, and then they realized that they're sitting on a discovery that could actually drive that problem set. And also, you mentioned collaboration, and that's sort of critical. There's no monopoly to innovation, both from a geographical perspective, from a country perspective, but there's also from a just people perspective. And so being able to cast a very wide network that is global, and being able to take a specialist in a very narrow field and combine and integrate his discovery or her discoveries into somebody else's discoveries that are also in a narrow field is part of the secret. So this interdisciplinary work is part of the secret to providing these solutions in what otherwise might be very risky propositions. And, if we were to just make a bet on one university or one research institute or one set of innovators, then that becomes a limiting factor, because you're only as good as their ideas. And inevitably, these are multi-form problems that requires an interdisciplinary set of approaches, including on the business execution, by the way.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. You know, well, one of the SDGs 17 is about partnerships, and I think it's there for a reason. You can't do it alone. The knowledge pledge relates to that. You bring in human capital knowledge to the table.
That's right.
I sometimes oversimplify things, I've been told, but I like oversimplifying. And it reminded me of somebody recently who they have 2 kids, and someone asked them if you're going to have a third. And they said, geez, I don't know, how am I going to split up the love between 3 when I'm doing it with just 2? Well, it doesn't split up the love. It just adds to the love at that point.
That's right. That's right. I have an only child, so I can't share by experience, but there's no question that the collaboration is critical. And as a matter of fact, when you look at some of our early moves, people are saying, how in the world are you going to spot the sectors, the solutions, when you have an entire venture capital industry trying to do similar things, even though they don't necessarily have the thesis around impact? And the answer is, you know, we're kind of a global citizen, and we're working. We are advocating for the problems that need solution, and we're curating those problems. The solutions are coming from a very wide network that spans all the stakeholders and has no borders.
And that's why I loved when we were introduced, because that's exactly what Fifth Element is based upon. And we were always told too, how can you do this? You know, you're gonna have a lower return if you're working with impact, or you can't take the time to do it. All this stuff that we've been told, but I think the risk is minimal. I think what's happening clearly is the scientists, the tech people, the finance people, you know, the supply chain people, they all want to go to companies big and small that are making an impact, because they finally are realizing, number one, life's short. What am I doing with my life?
That's right. Well, and there is a strategy which I've alluded to manage the risk, right? Big problems are risky, and they're especially risky when you are trying to solve them with research that is still in the lab, right, as opposed to closer to being products. And on the other hand, you typically will need to partner with the research in the lab if you're going to be disruptive and really truly have a solution. Mm-hmm. So how do you address that dilemma? And this is where I think a connection with classic philanthropy becomes really useful, as well as government. Mm-hmm. You know, what I pioneered within the global good ecosystem for Bill Gates was essentially a grant partnering between a philanthropic charitable trust and a business incubation / venture capital component. So for Adastro, we are striking critical partnerships with those centers of excellence that are typically either government or philanthropically funded. And we guide them in solving these problems so that they are working on the problems that we think will have the biggest impact. But we don't actually spend our limited partner capital, the business capital, until the investment by those non-dilutive investors has matured the technology so that we can quantify the pathway to market, the pathway to product, and the risk profile. And so this is a grant partnership between philanthropic capital, government capital, even in some cases multilateral organizations like the UN system, and private capital, to essentially use each bucket of capital at the appropriate level of risk. And you know, it would be crazy, and in some places not even possible, to ask a charitable institution to do investments a la part with a venture capital by the time a company is built that is a for-profit entity. But it is perfectly okay to incubate with this sort of non-dilutive capital an idea that has high mission and impact potential, and then delegate to a venture capital partner the incubation and development of the company that executes on that discovery. And this is how we mitigate risk at Adastro. We have partnerships with key research institutions that we don't fund, or we don't principally fund, but that will work collaboratively with us to sort of identify the problems that they want to put their charitable funds to work out, and can count on us doing the capital scale up once the discovery is no longer a lab experiment and it has a pathway into reality and solutioneering. And, by the way, in the ecosystem of innovation, that second phase is actually what costs the most money. So this is also appropriate because it brings the large capital resources of the private sector to what are now becoming businesses. And they're businesses that are doing the right thing, but are also sustainable because they make money. And to some extent, what I like to say is a company that is doing the right thing and can sustain themselves with a private sector model is the ultimate form of philanthropy. And if philanthropic dollars can help incubate it at the very beginning, and then investors' dollars can take it to scale, that's a great partnership.
We totally agree, and we call them omni-wins. I think I mentioned it, where there's alternate types of capital to bring to the table, and a lot of alternate types of capital to bring to the table at different stages that can all benefit. So why not use it all? It doesn't just have to be donations. It doesn't just have to be only investment for big returns. And I think that's the best way by far we're going to solve the big problems. What do you do when you invest in a company? Because the usual thing of the history of private equity is 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe years, sell it type of thing. Is that still in that process you're talking about, or do you go longer now because of the big problem?
Yeah, well, as a for-profit, even though we're impact venture capital fund, obviously delivering an exit and a time horizon for that exit so that we can deliver on our limited partners sort of return on investment goals is important. But, a lot of the venture capital model typically is based on the idea that you're not curating very well. You're not even curating the specific companies, let alone the sectors. And you kind of have a gunshot approach. And so you play a game of portfolio management, right? And so you're going to make an assumption that some large number of your investments are going to fail. And you're going to write them off because they're going to be made up by the 1 or 2% that are going to give you some outstanding returns because they are a unicorn in the making. And, so everybody's searching for the next Google. And if you were, behind a founding group that created Google, then you can afford a lot of losses and still have very nice returns. We don't ascribe to that model at all. I call that model the white elephant hunt. If you're really lucky, you can land on the next Google. But I think most of my colleagues in the venture capital world will tell you that it's really a matter of luck and timing more than anything else. It's not talent. To predict the next Google is a tall order, especially when you're dealing with frontier science and technology. So what that does tend to do is they tend to have a lemming mentality, where everybody thinks that some new sector or new discovery is worth investing because it's going to be the next Google. And so they all overinvest. And that actually creates these bubbles that have really not performed very well. So if you look at actually the return on investment of the average US venture capital firm, there are some that are doing better than others, but the results are pretty disappointing considering the risk that they're getting, nowadays especially. So we are, on the other hand, we're focused on the problems that we know will build the next Google. And the only question mark is, can we execute well enough, to solve the problem truly and achieve that scale? Okay. And so we don't really accept the idea that we're going to be constantly winding things down just to find the 1 or 2%. Now, of course, in our model, we have risk-adjusted metrics, and we expect that we will have some failures. Nothing is perfect, but this whole model of de-risking with other people's capital, primarily out of the nonprofit, and then using a known risk set to chase some of these really important scalable problem sets is we think will deliver a rather strong portfolio performance. And it doesn't have to be hinged just on financial speculation and flipping a company around or selling it or divesting it or all the classic things that private equity has to do to monetize their investment. Because at the end of the line, if you're sitting on a company that is generating dramatic amount of cash, that is operating globally, that is in high growth, it may actually be a very good thing to sit on it and not sell it.
Right.
Okay. So those are a little bit about our somewhat unusual horizon. But yeah, as a fund, we're structured so that we'll have essentially a 5-year investment period and a 5-year return period. And of course, this is just fund one of what we hope to be a succession of funds. So as we prove some of these dynamics, we expect to be doing it again.
Are you? I think it's exciting, and I think it's kind of interesting. Both our company names have movies named after them, if you will. Fifth Element and Ad Astra.
Although in my case, Ad Astra was not a great movie, so I wouldn't use it as an example, right? But actually, if you want to know the genesis of the name, it's Latin for to the cosmos or to the stars, and it's intended to capture the moonshot nature of what we're doing. And I also, early in my life, I used to work for one of Europe's leading research institutions, which was the Bell Labs of Europe, which was located at a place called Adastro Park. And it's actually the place where the code breakers broke the Nazi codes, back in World War II. So it has a long, long history of innovation and discovery. Part of British Telecom, then part of British Telecom. And so I was always inspired by that setting. So I picked that as the name.
I like it. I'm glad you shared that. I didn't know that. You talked a little bit about talent there. Well, first of all, I wanted to go back. Are you focusing on life sciences? I know and we are too, big in equal access to healthcare, underserved communities and stuff. Is that a focus or one of the focuses?
It's definitely a focus. So as you think in terms of this sort of planetary scale problems, and we see this as a continuum of issues that are often interrelated and that often can find solutions from classes of innovation that are also related. And so on one side, I see the planet and I see planetary health. And related, but on the other side of that continuum, I see the human and human health.
Yep.
And so our focus is that continuum between planetary health and human health. And, the examples of where those overlaps are all over us. I mean, people talk about this pandemic as, an unprecedented, unforeseen, once in every 500 years type of calamity. And I invite everybody to take a look at this speech that Bill Gates gave in 2015 on the coming pandemic, right, where it will give you chills because he predicts down to the economic damage, 100% everything that has happened. Okay. And by the way, made call to actions to the global community at the time to prevent it, which of course were promptly ignored. Okay. And I helped Bill create some of the data with one of the institutes that I worked on that were part of Global Good for that speech. And so I'm very familiar with the forecasts that he made. And the reality is we have had 22 pandemic potential bugs emerge since 1988. And it's just been sheer luck that we haven't had multiple COVIDs. And there will be another one. And it all relates to what's happening in population trends. It all relates to what's happening in our interaction with nature. It relates to the planet evolving. You know, the planet is on a giant petri dish and we've just turned up the heat. And it's not just global warming, but, you know, people haven't really asked the question of what are the human health implications of the changing planet. And then what are the human health implications of a changing planet with a 10 billion human population on it?
Yeah.
Okay. And when you really factor these sort of interdisciplinary questions, you can see that most of the negative trends and the big problems that are starting to emerge are not isolates. They're really sort of interrelated. And so increasingly, I think medicine will need to address planetary health and vice versa. Take a subject of nutrition. Okay. The same food grown in the same place today is less nutritious by some significant factors. And by the way, there is no sustainable way of growing enough food for a 10 billion planet. Okay. So, you know, on the other hand, we are in the midst of at least 3 revolutions in the biological and life sciences fields. They include genomics, which of course is a household term today, but all the other omics, plus the whole emergence of sort of integrated system biology, is allowing us to decode billions of years of evolution to solve some of these problems. So science has got a bunch of new tools that we haven't even begun to exploit to address some of these problems. And so that the intersect between these sort of new emerging, primarily biological platforms, combined with this sort of planetary scale problems and this continuum between planet and human health, is really our focus.
Yeah, it's funny because we work with a lot of agribusiness companies, soil regeneration, remediation, all that stuff, and yeah, it's you know, and then you combine that with our immune systems as human beings are not being taken care of to even not get sick from another pandemic.
And in addition to that, leveraging the immune system to essentially have the body create our own medicines is an example of where some of these technologies are going. And you know, it's all accelerating. Many people think that that the age of discovery may be behind us, and that's crazy. I mean, things are accelerating, and so what's going on in the labs around the world right now in areas like tissue engineering, like cellular agriculture, like you know, proteomics and metabolomics, in literally decoding key mechanisms, is going to be revolutionary, and we want to tap all that to solve the big problems that we're after.
It just shows you. I was speaking to another global leader, global speaker in AI and innovation and whatnot, and he was saying, in 10 years, you won't even recognize where we are in all this stuff.
No, I believe that.
And maybe even
I believe that.
years, it's going to be totally different. One last thing on that, you touched on scientists wanting to be involved and just talent in general, and the competition being fierce. Let's talk even more specific with your portfolio companies, if you will, your companies you invest in. How do you ensure that's your investment, that they are getting the best talent, that they are knowledgeable to get not only the best talent to work permanently with them, but even the knowledge from, let's say, a knowledge pledge to advise, etc.
Right. Well, you know, relationship with organizations like the Knowledge Pledge is critical, right? Because, you know, for example, under our joint agreement right now, we're literally sharing these problem spaces and actively contributing, you know, the know-how that emerges from the Knowledge Pledge approach to the incubation effort that we're driving. The second piece is this sort of notion of an incubator. It's not enough to put capital to work. That was actually the issue that I helped solve for Bill. Bill obviously had a lot of capital that he had been deploying, but it wasn't necessarily translating into products and companies, from that sort of research that he was stimulating. And it turns out that you need to get your hands dirty. You need to actually build you need to curate the problem. You need to assemble the talent. You need to provide a venue, such as a laboratory or whatever, to actually bring the interdisciplinary team together to focus on those solutions. And so we created a concept of an industrial laboratory, which is not just another research institution. It really is the catalyst of many of our research partners and the people that are going to ultimately incubate these companies, all working under one roof toward the common goal of sharing that. And that's one of our multiple levers to sort of ensure that the ultimate company execution fits the mission and fits the caliber of the science that they're working with.
That's amazing. So one last question on this segment, which is kind of like a two-parter. What do you, with all the stuff that's happened in 2020, Mother Nature's pretty pissed off at us. What are you most grateful for? And what are you most optimistic for in the future?
Well, I think with some exceptions, I think the pandemic has brought the role of science in solving big problems and the fact that the planet is a village into focus, right? There are those that want to build walls, but we just realized that a pathogen doesn't stop at any wall.
Yeah.
Okay. And so really, I think it was an accelerant in waking up ordinary folks, and by reflection, the political leadership. The discourse I'm seeing in DC today on global health security, on some of these sort of global factors is ages ahead of where it was in 2015 when that famous TED Talk attempted to sort of wake people up. And I see that occurring in many other countries. Now, there's plenty of issues. Vaccine delivery and availability around the world is clearly a continuing issue. These issues of equity in access to healthcare is probably a big drama. The fact that if you have a certain color of your skin or live in a certain place or are even a certain gender, you're more likely to have been significantly affected by, but again, the value of all these tragedies has been to put it in focus. Right. And it has woken up, including in the private sector, a lot of people. I'm hearing conversations in healthcare delivery systems, for example, about equity of access to care that I've never heard before. I'm hearing conversations about, in innovation circle, about the importance of diversity, because otherwise you're cutting off your spigot of innovation that I've never heard before. So I'm optimistic that these are all accelerants, and now we need people that actually want to do something about it. And for those, we're hoping to provide the capital for execution.
Well, I know of three for sure, or entities anyway. I know Ad Astral, Knowledge Pledge, Fifth Element. We got three for sure, and there's a bunch others that we can put together to create some OmniWins. So it's a delight talking to you. I really appreciate the time. You do definitely fit as one of the leaders who care. So there's a definite fit there. So thanks for that. And really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you to your audience for the attention. And thank you for caring.
It's easy. Thanks.